Everyone, thank you very much for coming to this last session by Carol Graham. I'm pleased to have you here, and even more pleased to introduce Dr. Carol Graham. Last but certainly not least, friend, collaborator, and one of the most prolific happiness scholars. I think she needs very little introduction. But anyway, in case you don't know her, we'll give you some background. So Carol is the Leo Pazvolsky Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, a College Park professor at the University of Maryland, and a senior scientist at Gallup. She's also currently the president of the International Society for Quality of Life Studies, kind of a, let's say, like a sister organization, you might say, to our own in some ways. She served on the National Academy of Sciences panel on well-being metrics for policy. She received Pioneer Awards from the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation in 2017 and 2021, and a Lifetime Distinguished Award from the International Society for Quality of Life Studies in 2018. From 2002 to 2004, she served as vice president at Brookings Institution. She's also served as special advisor to the vice president of the Inter-American Development Bank and a visiting fellow in the office of the chief economist of the World Bank, and as consultant to the International Monetary Fund and the Harvard Institute for International Development. She's the author of numerous books and articles. Her most recent books include Happiness for All, Unequal Lives, and Hopes in the in the Land of the Dream, which 2017, Princeton. The Pursuit of Happiness Toward an Economy of Well-Being, Brookings 2011, also published in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, and Happiness Around the World, The Paradox of Happy Peasants, and Miserable Millionaires, Oxford University Press, also published in Chinese and Portuguese. She has published articles in a range of prestigious journals, too many to name. She's the senior editor at the Behavioral Science and Policy and associate editor at the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. She has an AB from Princeton University, an MA from Johns Hopkins, and a DPhil from Oxford University, and is the mother of 3 beautiful children. Also, one of the major supporters of our science field more generally. If you ever have the opportunity to see her in person, please go do. It's one of my favorite opportunities to do so. One of my favorite people to meet in person. Carol, with that, I'm pleased to just pass the floor over to you, and you can get started. Thanks.
Thank you, Kelsey, and it's a pleasure to be here on Zoom. I wish I could be there in person. For a number of reasons, I'm not, but I hear it's been a great time and lots of good times, including last night. I really wish I'd been there. So I imagine you all are at the end of a very long day, and I will try and keep this short and hopefully interesting. And I'd really love questions, comments, interruptions. I'm always up for those. I'm used to the rude Brookings economists that don't like the way your first slide looks and comment on that. So whatever you do after that is easier than what I'm used to. So I'm going to talk about what I think and should be a new dimension in well-being, I don't think a replacement dimension, but an additional one, which is hope. The more I study hope and unfortunately despair, the more I think it has very distinct qualities from, say, life satisfaction or even eudaimonia. And I'll try and convince you through some of the things I'm going to show why I think it matters, and why I think it matters probably more today than even when we started in this enterprise several decades ago. But anyway, so on I go. And before moving on to that, I'd also like to thank Kelsey, who's also a wonderful friend and co-author, and Francesco for inviting me and being patient with the video links and all sorts of annoying things. All right. So I have to say, it's pretty exciting to even see how many people are there, to see the kind of, reaction you all have had to the conference, and more generally where the field is. As one of the early so-called crazy economists in the field, along with the 2 Andrews who are there, I can't believe really where we are today. And not only has it become a flourishing field in many disciplines in academia, in economics, of course, but also in some others. But it's begun to really contribute to policy frames in a number of countries. And I would say, as horrible as COVID has been, and unfortunately still is, I think it showed the contributions that the field of the economics of happiness, well-being, and the field of the science of measuring well-being more generally, can make, and how it's important not to replace GDP, but to think about why and how well-being metrics are complementary, important gauges of progress, but also as important ways to take society's temperature, so to speak. They give us a tool to see how people are doing, and often how they're doing and what the standard metrics like GDP tell us are very different. And also, I think one reason we can be confident about all that is we do now have a robust science. It took us a while to get there. When we started, we just used what we knew was in the data, which was happiness questions and a few surveys. And then more and more people started working with the data, more methods got more complicated, or more sophisticated, sorry. More young and rising star scholars joined us, which really helped. And so I'd say, we now can speak from a position of confidence and hope that more and more policymakers and governments start to take us seriously. I hear you've had some traction in Luxembourg, so I'm excited about that. And again, I wish I could be there. So in many countries, governments have started to put well-being metrics as inputs into their budgetary and health policy decisions. And most countries, most wealthy countries, except of course for the US, have been putting well-being metric into their national statistics. There are now guidelines for the best way to do so that governments around the world can coordinate. And in the same way that there's some agreement on what goes into GNP, there's also agreement on what goes into measuring well-being, so that the measures are comparable, not just over time within countries, but across countries. The OECD has issued, I think, some robust guidelines. I don't really see a reason to depart from those if governments are going to launch into the process. And I would say that a first step towards enhancing well-being and health in a serious way in countries is to have the official statistics or to have the well-being metrics in official statistics. As we say, what gets measured is what gets, worked on. And if it isn't measured, it tends to be ignored. And again, the US is well behind in that process. And indeed, because it did not have well-being metrics in its national statistics, the metrics that did come out, the gauge metrics that came out during COVID, are actually really contradictory. They're like 4 or 5 separate surveys that have questions about anxiety and depression, but they don't have positive well-being questions. They're all based on different questions. And so the main official surveys in the US now completely contradict each other on what happened to mental health in the US during COVID, which is really pretty tragic, because if you're going to try and do something about a problem, it's pretty hard to do that if you don't really know where it's most severe, what cohorts are suffering the most. Anyway, so, I mean, one thing I feel like we shouldn't have to justify, but I think there's some real questions, some serious questions that well-being metrics are particularly useful for answering, that standard revealed preferences approaches don't answer very well. The ones I work on, they're not the only questions, but these are situations where individuals do not have the agency to make choices. And in the case where behaviors are driven by norms, such as discrimination, or by addiction and self-control problems, rather than optimal rational choices. And so what we find is that the metrics often show us that despite people pursuing these behaviors, they actually report to not be satisfied with their lives, or not be very happy, or to be in despair, even though if a rational choice model would assume that they're purchasing drugs because they want to, and it's an optimal choice. So as I mentioned, I think we should have hope as a distinct and additional well-being metric. We measure evaluative well-being, which obviously are cognitive assessments of life satisfaction, and also hope and optimism. We have hedonic well-being, sort of daily experiences such as smiling or stress. And then I think most recently more progress has been made in measuring and understanding eudaimonia. I think it's a really important dimension, having purpose and meaning in life. And a lot of the data and populations I work with lack purpose and meaning in life, and also lack hope. And that's a pretty pretty awful combination. I will show you a bit more in a couple of slides. Now, whether you have 4 questions or 5 questions, they're very quick. They're inexpensive to collect. Each question takes about 30 seconds in a survey to answer. So this is not an expensive proposition for governments to both either launch into or to continue to pursue measurement of well-being in their official statistics. The reason I think hope is so important is because of its links to future-oriented behavior. Hope and optimism are very different. So in the sense that they both are being positive about the future, but unlike optimism, which just assumes the future will be better, hope is linked to being able or wanting to do something about it. It has an agency as part of its definition, and I think that's incredibly important. And Martin Berger and also Emily Pleging have written really, really interesting stuff on this as well. And lastly, what I'm going to talk about now fits into sort of more general research on how not only unequal distributions of income and opportunity, but unequal distributions of well-being and hope are bad for our future health and posterity. And we see that hope for the future is strongly associated with better long-term outcomes. Kelsey and I have a paper in GBO in 2019 on how hope or optimism is associated with higher levels of longevity and better health. And there are many more papers along those lines. I don't think I need to talk about the method. You all know it. If you didn't know it before, by the end of 4 days, I'm sure you do. The only important thing about this slide is obviously we're not asking people if certain things make them happy, right? We're taking the data on their well-being and their characteristics as different, within a different as ways to then run the answers with econometric equations. Okay, now there's a fair amount of debate about the U-curve, or not a fair amount, some debate, but like many people who work on this, I'm pretty convinced by the amount of evidence and convinced by the amount of people in countries who conform to the curve. But the reason I'm showing this slide is really not to launch into a debate about the U-curve, but to note that the same years where you get a midlife dip in well-being in general tend to be the same years where you also see increases in despair and suicide, in antidepressant use, in stress. And so there's something to this. And I do a lot of worrying about people in despair and deaths of despair. And again, that highlights why I care about hope. So one thing that came out of studying deaths of despair is realizing that well-being metrics could be really good tracking mechanisms. I started looking at the gaps between the well-being of the poor and the rich across regions and found that they were much greater in the US than they are in Latin America, which is a region with high levels of inequality, high levels of poverty, obviously not as wealthy as the US. But I was struck by the gaps in the US between the rich and poor. The gaps, for example, on belief in hard work, which is a classic American dream question. It also captures sort of agency and optimism. That was the biggest gap, right? So the rich believe in the American dream and the poor do not, which is not a surprise if you live in the US today. The other thing I found, which I'll talk more about, are huge differences across races in the US, and they don't run in the direction that you think they would. So what I find also is that lack of hope is probably the most important marker that's more closely linked to deaths of despair than any other well-being metric. So we find that despair is linked to poor objective health, to high levels of reported pain, to opioid addiction, and as well as to labor force dropout. And so what we find is that of all groups, white prime-age males who are out of the labor force are the worst off group. And we find in general that people out of the labor force are not in good shape at all. And one reason for that is when people who are out of the labor force have dropped out permanently, right? So they aren't counted in the unemployment rate. So when we were boasting pre-COVID, the US was boasting record lows in unemployment, of 4%. We had 25% of prime age males out of the labor force. But if you weren't looking for a job for more than 6 months, you fall out of the ratio. And so you can have an official low unemployment rate and a lot of people completely out of the labor force. In developing countries, what you tend to have is larger numbers of people working in the informal sector that do not get well counted. But what you get in in developed countries is out of the labor force, just people who are not even looking for work. And the US seems to be the poster child for not only many of them, but for a cohort that's in very bad health. So, if you look at the opposite of despair and out of the labor force, you think about hope. And again, what you wonder about is, how does hope work? How does it affect future outcomes? And I think it's very simple, that if you believe in your future, you're much more likely to invest in it. So I can say that, but maybe I should test it out, right? So I've done many things, including the paper we did, Kelsey and I did, but since then, I've been taking surveys of low-income young adults, both starting in Peru, but also in the US. And I find that adolescents, these are about 18 to 19 years old, with higher levels of hope are more likely to aspire to and achieve higher education and to avoid risky behaviors that jeopardize their health. And one of the things I find is that there's a big difference in education aspirations between poor whites and poor Blacks and poor Hispanics in the US. And rather ironically, it's the poor minority kids who are much more likely to believe in education and in the value of education as a way to get ahead, versus low-income whites tend to not trust college in the same way that they no longer trust science. Some of that is ideological, but it's not only that. It sort of comes from a trajectory of a high school education being enough, if you were white, to get you a stable middle-class existence. And unfortunately, that is not a trajectory that exists anymore. So I'm going to speak a little bit more about the surveys in the next few slides. But before getting to that, I do want to talk a little bit about deaths of despair in the US, as well as racial differences in hope and optimism. So one thing we found in 2015, I think I've shown this slide before, many of you are probably familiar with it, but it still remains, one, a bit of a surprise, and two, it was a remarkably lasting pattern. This is not the year it was done or whatever. So that poor Blacks among poor whites on this slide, or the left out group, that poor Blacks are the most optimistic of all low-income racial groups. Blacks are more optimistic than all racial groups in general, but the gap is biggest at the low-income level. I think in part because low-income whites are, as we know increasingly, are a group which is very much in despair. Hispanics are also optimistic. Asians are actually less optimistic than, at least poor Asians are less optimistic than poor whites. But the big gap is really with African Americans, which happens to be the group that's most discriminated in the US, that's had the hardest time in the US, and yet they're the most optimistic. So what drives that? Many things could drive it. Several things we did to make sure was, one, to make sure it wasn't a Pollyanna effect. And so we controlled for religion. We asked people about how they felt about their financial situation, about their city satisfaction. And the same optimistic poor Blacks were certainly very realistic about their situations. They didn't think their objective situations were good, but they were optimistic about the future and their ability to change them. And I found that this finding of optimism among low-income Blacks holds it held through Trump's election, through the Trump years, through COVID, when low-income Blacks were, along with low-income Hispanics, were the most vulnerable groups. So anxiety increased among those groups, but optimism remained high. Again, so this is a very lasting finding. And you also see that in a way you could say, again, who cares about hope or optimism until you see this slide, which is deaths of despair in the United States. And so these are all rich. This is aside from Case and Eaton. These are all wealthy countries. And you can see the line that departs from decreasing mortality is the red line, which are US non-Hispanic whites, right? It's going up rather than down. It's going in the wrong direction. Those deaths are due to deaths of despair. If the thick blue line is US Hispanics, as you see, it's going down with the rest of the wealthy countries. If you had a line for US African Americans, it would be right next to the blue line, and it would be going down until 2019, 2020. And then we've had, unfortunately, an increase of overdoses due to fentanyl, and so an increase of deaths of despair and minorities entering that group for the first time. But I think it's, while their rate of increase has been high because they weren't in there at all before, it's actually their levels of death and their levels of everything but overdose is very, very low. And now their levels of drug overdoses have gone up along with everybody's, unfortunately. And I can talk more in detail about that if anybody wants more gory details after. Just this is to give you a sense of the COVID shock. These are changes in opioid overdoses in 2020 compared to 2019 in the US. And what we have is a paradox of sorts, which is that suicide rates went down actually in 2020, very modestly. At least they stayed the same. If depends how you count them in 2020 compared to 2019. But opioid overdose rates rose by 30%. So we had 93,000 overdose deaths in 2020 compared to 70,000 in 2019. This is from EMS data, which is first responder activations, which we did before the CDC released their data, which is always with at least a 1-year lag. We did this in 2021. But now the CDC data accords with this, which also gave us confidence that we could use the EMS data in the future, as the things we found and then the CDC eventually reported were about the same. So there clearly is a very large, we already had a crisis of deaths of despair. And as in many countries, COVID wreaked havoc on people's mental health and on their associated behaviors. Here is what I was talking about, which is the sort of unbelievable resilience of low-income Blacks, even during this period. So if you can see, that is reported optimism as measured as the Cantrell ladder in 5 years. So the future, how satisfied you think with your life you will be in the future. And you see again that low-income Blacks are the highest the whole way through the pandemic. And then another question about being stressed. And again, low-income Blacks report the lowest amount of stress, even though they at the same time did have an increase in anxiety. So I'm a little less confident that there isn't a question phrasing issue on the second side. But for the optimism about the future, it's just such a consistent finding with low-income Blacks that I was surprised that it was that consistent during COVID, but it was. So here's to my digging deeper into hope. And this is a quote from Amanda Gorman. And I think it captures the dimensions of hope that we care about the most if we're going to think about it seriously as a well-being dimension that we should that we really should take seriously, that we should include. And its hope is not a promise we give, it's a promise we live. And so what that quote is very much capturing is the agency element to hope, that it isn't just being hopeful about, optimistic about the future, but it's again this agentic property that it isn't just a belief that things will get better, but there are things that you can do to make your life better. And there's a great distinction that I think it's Arthur Brooks who makes, that the difference between the tragic optimist, the sort of optimist who continues to be optimistic no matter what happens, versus the hopeful pessimist, right? Who knows that things are bad, but is hopeful that they can get better. And so I think that's an important distinction as we think about this. And the other thing I think most about, unfortunately, is that the opposite of hope is despair. So despair is very much giving up. It's sort of it's not even, you don't even know if life is worth living or not, as evidenced by all the deaths of despair. And so now we see in the US that despair is not only a health issue, but as it certainly is, because we have so many deaths. We've had between 2005 and 2020, we had almost 1 million deaths of despair in the US. So those are premature preventable deaths among middle-aged people. And that just doesn't make any sense. And then of course we had COVID, and we still had high numbers of deaths of despair the exact same year. I forgot, sorry, I'm just realizing I forgot to say in the slides on suicide and opioid overdoses, one reason that suicide may have not increased or gone down a little bit is that opioid overdose deaths went way up, and we really don't know how many of those are intentional, because unless the person leaves a note, the coroner just codes it as an opioid overdose death, not a suicide. And yet, I don't want to say they're interchangeable, but a lot of them are. So if you're that addicted that you want the highest dose of fentanyl, even though you know it might kill you, do you code that as an intentional death or not? Without getting too into detail, but it does sort of drum home how deep this crisis of despair is. And the other thing we're finding is that it isn't just health, but it's also that desperate people are much more likely to be radicalized, to believe in conspiracy theories. And we're finding a very strong link between despair and right-wing radicalization. And that is actually, much of that work is done by neuroscientists. And so I think we are at a point where we really need to take the both well-being and ill-being a lot more seriously than we have in the past, because I think at least in the US, we really have a crisis of despair. And I think other countries that are facing deindustrialization, threats to low-wage labor from technology-driven growth, are going to find similar problems, although not as extreme, because most other countries have better health systems and also better social safety nets. Meanwhile, psychiatrists who admit that hope is understudied also note that restoring hope is actually a critical element in recovering from mental illness, that even people on the correct medication or whatever kind of treatment that you deem appropriate are not going to recover if they don't have hope, if they don't believe that their life is worth living, that their life can get better. And so hope is, I think, again, the trait that matters the most is sort of the individual agency that people with mental health have lost, and that hope very much has as part of it there, again, the belief that you yourself can make your life better. So hope is in part an inherited trait, right? There's certainly some hereditary parts to it. If you think about how genes in the environment interact as a component of IQ, I think hope is a bit the same way, that you have part of it's inherited. Well-being is a bit the same way generally, that there is a heritable part of it, but people's environments also contribute to it, and how they interact with their environment and then cope with it or thrive with it or are in despair. Heckman and I've forgotten the name of the co-author, but Heckman has a really nice paper on socio-emotional skills and how that those change and develop longer in life than, say, IQ and cognitive skills, so that people really can, sort of people aren't just endowed with certain personality traits and that's the end of it. I mean, certainly if they're negative enough, maybe there are people that never get, beyond some bad personality traits, but on average, people can learn and develop these traits. And he focuses on the big five: conscientiousness, agreeableness, openness to experience, extroversion, and then neuroticism. But I think hope is another one that captures lots of what those traits have. And I think what's interesting to well-being scientists is that people can develop these skills throughout the life course, and in the same way that there are interventions to increase life satisfaction or reduce loneliness or whatever it might be, we can start to think about trying to restore hope in populations where it's been lost. That's a big challenge, and I can't say I have the answers. It's something I'm working on and would like to develop further. And then we also find that lack of hope is linked to a range of later life mental health issues and much lower life expectancy, as Kelsey and I have found. So very quickly, I don't want to go too long. Just a little bit more detail on these hope surveys among low-income adolescents. So it was called the Thinking About the Future survey, and we asked these adolescents about their aspirations for their future, especially education aspirations, about risky behaviors, the role of parents and other mentors in supporting their aspirations. And we piloted this survey in Peru in a sample of households that paralleled the Young Lives survey. For those of you that know about the Young Lives survey, it's an amazing panel funded by DFID and run out of Oxford, which follows kids born in the millennium through now. So the oldest kids are now in their 20s, and it's followed their whole, it's been about 4 rounds of surveys throughout their life course, very detailed questions about maternal well-being, maternal and paternal health, education opportunities, kids' health, kids' progress learning. And it's done in 4 poor countries: Peru, Vietnam, Uttar Pradesh in India, and I'm blanking on the 4th country, Ethiopia. So it's a wonderful, it's a host of panel data. But what we did is we took households that sort of paralleled the Young Lives survey households, and we used their sampling technique. And we found this was in a poor peri-urban neighborhood in Peru. I mean, half of it has pavement and running water and electricity. Half of it is still, if any of you all know the slums of Lima, it's very much sand hills. It's pretty much unpaved, tapped in electricity illegally, and they still buy water from trucks. 85% of our 400 respondents aspire to college or postgraduate education. And we revisited them 3 years later and found that the high aspiration kids were generally on track with their education aspirations. Graduate school, college and graduate school, there is publicly available in Peru. Obviously, if you're poor, you forego income that you might earn in the same time by not working, but it's possible, and people believe very strongly in education. We found a couple of things in addition. The high aspiration kids also were less likely to pursue risky behaviors and which jeopardize their health, like unsafe sex and taking drugs. Not a surprise, but kind of amazing how consistently we found that. We also found that aspirations were persistent within persons. So the high aspiration kids maintained high aspirations even if they had negative shocks, and most of them had negative shocks. And then the other thing we found that was absolutely critical is that the high aspiration kids also had mentors or parents, even who believed in them achieving their education, even though none of the parents in our survey had college education. So that's kind of it shows the importance of just support. Even though these parents hadn't gone to college, they wanted their kids to do better than that. And what's interesting is that pattern is repeated in minorities in the US, but not among poor whites. And so in Missouri, we interviewed in an African-American school district and in a poor white school district. We did the Thinking About the Future survey adapted for an American context. And due to COVID, unfortunately, we had to do mail-in as opposed to in-person, which we originally planned. The Missouri sample is not as big by any means as the Peru sample, in part because of the mail-in responses they weren't, I mean, we had like a 25% response rate, which really isn't bad given mail-in surveys, but it wasn't like Peru, where we were able to visit and revisit houses. And we had about 40 responses equally divided across Black and white respondents, a couple of other minorities, but mainly Black and white. And what we found is that the African-American respondents who were materially worse off, for example, they were less likely to, or their parents were less likely to own their own home. They often had a parent missing. At the same time, they were much more hopeful. They had much higher education aspirations. They had much more trust in others, and they had support from a parent or other family member. And like the kids in Peru, there were plenty of negative shocks, and in this case, the COVID shock as well. In contrast, the white respondents were better off financially. They're much more likely to own their own homes. These are not wealthy people, believe me, but they were slightly better off. The kids had much lower hope, much lower education aspirations, and they also had very little trust in others. They weren't even very connected to their parents, and their vision of life was very individualistic. They valued being self-reliant and thought that they were. And equally important, their parents actively did not aspire for them to go beyond high school. They were opposed to them pursuing college. And what I see with that pattern is that you're going to have the next generation in despair, because in these labor markets, a high school education from a public education in the US is worth about the dollar it takes to buy a Coke, right? I mean, you really are not going to get far with those. And you don't need to go to college, but you need to invest in the kinds of socio-emotional and cognitive skills, non-cognitive skills that Heckman talks about to make it in today's labor markets, particularly in the low income sector, low skill sector, where most of the jobs are service jobs now. The old blue collar work is just rapidly disappearing. So then again, the question is, what do we do about it? And it's, can hope be learned or restored where it has been lost, is a very, very big question. Can we transfer lessons of hope among minorities to white, low-income whites in the US, for example? And I have to say, I don't know the answer. I'd like to test it out. I have a new book coming out also with Princeton called Hope and Despair. I hope it's out in the fall. And I describe many of the interventions we know about that have been successful in enhancing well-being and enhancing community well-being, even enhancing hope among people. But I don't know, if we really can translate the lessons that we've learned that easily. I'm most focused right now on the young, because they run the risk of, not making it in tomorrow's labor markets if they don't get educated. And the patterns certainly suggest that, a large percent of the low-income cohort in the US has no plans to get educated. And so I think that's only going to make not only our health crisis of deaths of despair worse, but it's going to make our civil society problems, which loom large, also worse. So I know this is supposed to be a lecture on hope, and I'm talking about despair, so let's switch slides here. And just really quickly to wrap up, I'd really love to hear some questions. As I mentioned, I think we have confidence that we have a robust science of well-being measurement. Like anything else, we can learn more, we can adapt more. We have great new young scholars involved in the field. We have studies happening in terms of genes, in terms of large N, in terms of experiments, many, many things going on, which not just yield interesting and valuable findings, but continue to refine the method. And like GNP or GDP, the measures are constantly adapted, right? And adjusted to account for changes in economies, changes in what people purchase, all sorts of things. I don't think iPhones were counted in GNP 20 years ago, and they probably are now. I don't know for sure. But and then I think the other reason we really should think about well-being well beyond income data is that well-being has important causal properties. And I think that's a really exciting research area. I did a paper that was laughed at about 20 years ago called Does Happiness Pay? Although it's cited a lot now, that showed that happier people live longer and are more productive. Kelsey and I have our paper on hope and longevity. But there are many other papers now that show that people with higher levels of well-being not are just healthier and live longer, but they lead more productive lives. They lead better lives. And how many more objectives do we have that are really more important than that, if that's what we aim for as social scientists? And then back to the crisis of despair in America, I'm very worried about it. Love to move, actually, back to Peru or somewhere, but because our country really is a mess. But I think that despair is a big part of it. I think when people are desperate, it's very easy to radicalize them. And there's so many awful examples like Weimar Germany and other ones. And I think the US really is at a juncture. And I'm hoping that well-being metrics actually help us get out of this crisis. But again, I may be the tragic optimist on that one. And then lastly, more generally and across countries, to get beyond the US, I think understanding the implications of hope and despair will help us understand lots of different things, like differences in norms of health, the drivers of adaptation and resilience, and many other things that help us understand a whole range of health issues and behaviors across populations. And I think in the end, that really will help the lives of many people. And again, if we're social scientists, and why are we social scientists? I think one reason is to make people's lives better, to provide solutions or policies that can make the lives of people better. So I hope both academics in the field and many governments in the field move further in the direction of trying to understand hope and ultimately to measure it and include it in our toolkit of metrics to track well-being and hopefully better the well-being of societies. So with that, I hope there's some questions. And if you're too tired, I understand too. It's obviously been a long 4 days.
Carol, I'm sorry. I think you just missed the clapping. I didn't have the mic on. I don't know if it's off mute. Make sure you get that one going. Yeah. All right. So yes, we can take questions now. We got one, I think, first in the back. Francesco, yeah, Christopher. So I wish you could see the audience, Carol, but unfortunately we can't for the moment. You got it? That's all right. As long as don't show me how many people are asleep. Nobody's asleep. Nobody's asleep.
Thank you so much for the very inspiring talk. Could you talk about the relation between religion and hope? And especially with your comments on America, right, on a micro level, being more religious in the US is associated with better mental health, like a range of positive outcomes. But on the other hand, Europe is much less religious, right, on a macro level than the US, and it seems like conditions are better in the US. So I was just thinking, how do you think of religion as a correlate of hope, or maybe sometimes as a negative when people are like not taking active agency and rather deferring to other things? Right. I'm a little mixed about religion. I think that and first of all our regressions, for example, among differential levels of hope among minorities and whites, control for religion. Not that I want to dismiss it, but I want to make sure that my findings are not driven by religion, not least because Blacks in America are the racial group that most likely to report that religion is important in their lives. So I think even though we control for religion, there are things about religion that do contribute to hope and well-being and life satisfaction. And I think it's more the communal part of it. It's not believing that somebody's going to come and solve all the problems. It's the community that surrounds, particularly the religions that minorities have. Baptist churches, Latin families and Catholic churches tend to be kind of community religions versus the religion that particularly low-income whites have, the evangelicals, is very much about your individual relationship with God rather than about the community.
And go figure, it doesn't seem to do a whole lot for hope. So I think religion is an interesting and important area. I don't want to say I've steered away from it. I recognize that there isn't, that there isn't a great answer to that. I've done a little bit of work in the past on sort of why are religious people happier, and what we find is that that people who are religious tend to be happier, but if they are in a religion that's in the extreme minority in their country, they're not happier. And if they're in sort of an extreme religion, any kind of extreme religion, you don't get the well-being effects at all. But I do think there's some really interesting externalities surrounding religion. And actually, Andrew Clark and colleagues have a great paper. He probably has forgotten about it. He's written so many papers, but he has a paper that shows in Europe, not in the US, that even atheists are made more happy if they're more religious people in their neighborhood. So I think there you get the kind of the communal part about religion, the spillover effects that if religion is not extreme, likely have a positive effect. But I think I'm more interested in understanding how to build supportive communities. I talk a lot in some of my work about minorities having communities of empathy that are built by knowing that, in fact, the system isn't fair and people fall behind, and they're not poor because it's their fault. And you probably know somebody that's fallen behind, or maybe your sister or brother has. And so these communities play a huge role in people's lives in the absence of better public safety nets in the US. So I think if you find a more extreme sort of religion well-being link in the US, it's because it's probably making up for what other countries have in the form of better public social support. I don't know if that's a good answer, but it's a stab.
Thanks. Yeah, we got a few more questions. And
thank you for your talk. So I was just curious to ask you, does it depend on when we ask people about their hope? I was thinking that when we are in a recession or in bad times, if you ask, are you hoping for the better days? Of course, people hope more for better days. And when we are okay, so when we are not in a recession, or we are in, let's say, not during COVID or not during a conflict, probably hope for better days can be different. So is there a possibility to make an exercise within a variation of the same individual in better times or in worse times, how hope change and how this idea of hope might change? And the second thing, also hope changes by age. When you are younger, probably hope for better days is different when you are in older times. So I want to know what are your thinking about this. Thank you very much.
Sure. I'm thinking about it. I can't fully answer it, but I have a few answers that we know, in part due to following people over time, which is that hope seems to be persistent within people, right? It may fluctuate a little bit, but the findings on African Americans over time, over very bad times and much better times like the Obama presidency, the hope is quite consistent. High levels of hope during COVID. In a way, at some level, it speaks to your point that it persists despite things being bad, but it doesn't seem to fluctuate enough to say it's only there when things are bad. Another example along those lines is the war in Ukraine, right? And how powerful hope can be, right? You get the Ukrainians, and also how powerful community and collective spirit is, but that against all odds, they are holding, a much bigger, wealthier, invading country back. And I think some of it is just sheer, will and hope that they can save their country, and sort of a shared collective feeling, which brings me to maybe the third example in terms of who's most hopeful, which it does seem to be that people who have more challenges, right, who aren't well endowed from the start, tend to have higher levels of hope than you would think, right? So low-income African Americans, for example, versus, low-income whites who materially are advantaged over low-income African Americans, but their hope is much, much lower, in part because they're being caught up with, right? They're going backwards, and they don't believe they can change. Their only way to change things in the narrative is to go back to the past, right? Make America great again, which is, honestly, it's a racial, let's make America white again. And America's far from that. In fact, whites are going to be the minority population cohort in the next 10 years, which is fine with me. Anyway, and then I think the age question also, I think it depends. If you look at large N data, obviously as people get older, they tend to get up till a certain age, they tend to get a bit more satisfied with their lives. They're less likely to get more optimistic, but some maintain their optimism. And in the US, African Americans are the only cohort that retains their same high levels of optimism into old age, which is pretty incredible. And it does suggest the deeper roots of hope that we don't fully understand, and that some populations are more likely to have it than others. So again, lots of questions still need to be answered.
Hi, Carol. Thank you so much for a great talk. You can't see me, but this is Laura Kudrina from the University of Birmingham.
Oh, hey, good to see you. Or not good to see you. I can't see you. Good to hear you.
Good to see you as well. You've given a similar talk before, and in that talk, you talked about using subjective well-being as an early warning system for deaths of despair. And I was wondering if you could please say a little bit more about that and how it could be done in practice. On Monday, I have a meeting with the integrated care systems in the UK, which are new health partnerships that aim to embed kind of community well-being in what they do. And they're interested in this idea and how hope, for example, and measuring that could be able to predict deaths that they experience in their system and what they could do to avert those. Thank you.
Well, that's a great question. And indeed, I thought I mentioned it, but I probably covered too much ground too quickly. But yeah, I mean, well-being metrics can be great tracking systems. And we found that, and in some more recent work, since we found that, again, in a longitudinal way, since the talk I gave at Birmingham, that mental health increases at the community level in a mental health problem increases, predict higher levels of deaths of despair in the same places across the US 2 to 4 years later. So that's the first finding where we've said this isn't just, we've never claimed causality. It's just I think it's too difficult. There are too many other things going on. But certainly that's a warning indicator, and it's persistent across places in the US. And the tracking mechanism was very easy. I mean, the metrics that really stood out the most in terms of linkages to deaths of despair were high levels of worry and low levels of hope, right? And mainly the most consistent marker was no hope, right? Not having hope for the future, which is essentially despair. So despair tends to precede deaths of despair. It's sort of not a very complicated equation, right? Except we've shown that it works. And so how do you track them? You measure and look at these things. And you know more about how to do that than I do, or at least the same, right? They're inexpensive metrics to collect, and the UK is very well positioned to do so, because it's already, for the most part, doing it. How do you integrate those metrics into these new efforts to deliver mental health in a community manner? And I think believe it or not, there's some really interesting efforts in the US along those lines. Even the White House is sort of encouraging them now. And I was just on a call yesterday with somebody who's pretty integrally involved, and they totally agree on the role of hope, right? The role, how do you restore it? And as I said, I think that we don't know yet, but there are plenty of examples, and what Works Wellbeing Center in the UK is a great one to start, right? So if there are lessons about how do you reduce loneliness, there are they're related ways that you could increase hope. And look, so I think the first step is obviously knowing which populations are most vulnerable that you want to focus on. And then the next step is, what kinds of interventions will work in a particular population. And, we certainly know how to identify the people that are most vulnerable. And I would say we feel pretty strongly that lack of hope is the most, at least in the US, it's the marker that's most associated with deaths of despair. And even in other countries, I think populations that lack hope tend to have all these other things that make them more vulnerable. They're less healthy. They live, they don't live as long. They don't really have any incentive to invest in their future. So they are, in a way, by definition, vulnerable.
Maurizio Pugno from University of Cassino. What about the internal locus of control? Does it say the similar thing than hope? That is urgency of people?
Yeah, that's a great question. They're very closely associated. And in fact, in our Peru survey, the Missouri survey was messier and the N is smaller, so I don't want to draw too much from that, except the consistency and the racial differences. But in our Peru survey, our adolescents with high aspirations had a much higher internal locus of control, right? So we tested for that. So I can say there's an association or a linkage. I don't want to say one is more important than the other. I would imagine they're pretty natural partners.
Hi, Carol. It's Francesco.
Hi, Francesco. How are you?
I have the privilege. I can wave at you. Great to see you.
I wish I could do more than wave, but thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk and for sharing your finding with us today. You've been of great support for us. I have a very little question to ask you because you've been thinking a lot onto hope and despair. You've been elaborating on this a lot. And I wonder, considering your experience, what would be an institutional approach? What can institutions do to limit despair and promote hope, if anything? Thank you.
Well, that's not a little question. That's a big question. I'm working a lot on it. So, we're at a stage where I've identified or we collectively have identified the problem. What's the solution? And I think where I have the most confidence is that knowing that the community can play a big role in it, knowing that people who have some sort of support and mentorship, particularly young people who don't really know how to prepare for their future, particularly in very changing and challenging labor markets, that can be invaluable. And we've seen that. And that's, again, that's the low-hanging fruit. Those are the ones that I think are very likely to be useful interventions. I think the biggest question that we don't have an answer to is, and psychiatrists and psychologists, I don't think have the answer to either, which is, so neither economists or psychiatrists do, but we could argue about that, but we know which populations have higher levels of hope, and we know that for some reason, it doesn't seem to be correlated with having means or being wealthy. It has a lot more to do with kind of collective ties, communities. You could say maybe religion. I don't think religion varies too much to make any claims about religion, but that, so we know, and we know kind of the support mechanisms that they have and share. How do we transfer those to populations that are in despair and populations that in the US, for example, there's kind of the white Anglo-Saxon individualistic, you work hard, you get ahead, if you're poor, it's your fault, you didn't try hard enough. And that's been taken to an extreme. There's a wonderful book by a philosopher at Harvard called Michael Sandel, and the book is called The Tyranny of Merit. It's really a fascinating book about how it's become if you win, you deserve to, and if you lose, you're a loser sort of society. And yet people obviously have huge advantages in getting ahead in the US, everything from income to better education, to better support systems, to helicopter parents, which I don't think are good, but in other words, kids in every kind of activity you can imagine, versus kids who are in awful schools and can't even play outside without getting shot. Of course they're going to have different outcomes. So, but they're still there. I don't really know all of the answers by any means. I mean, that's why I think it's a really interesting area, and I think it's showing up due to the kinds of social crises that we have to be a very important area where we need to learn more. But I do think, and as I said in response to Laura's question, there are some examples out there of programs and interventions that work, and that's a good start.
Thank you so much.
Were there any other questions? I have a question myself, but okay. So Carol, you said that we could use these tools to address the current crisis in the United States. And I'm thinking that is partially the polarization. So can you elaborate further on how you think that we might be able to use, I don't know, say a hope intervention, assuming we had a good one, to address the crisis?
Yeah, that's a tough question. But when you think about the populations in despair, they have no sense of community. They have no sense of purpose. They tend to they're quite lonely. I mean, the UK has done wonderful things looking at loneliness and how do you combat it? Because people who are lonely tend to have worse outcomes and it tends to be linked with. There's no causally proven channel from loneliness to depression, but it's not a surprise. So these same cohorts are sort of fodder for radicalization, for false information. They're very vulnerable to misinformation. They're very vulnerable to being politicized. And they also tend to be not very educated. So, you add that to it. And they also tend to live in places that are what we call information deserts, right? And so we're developing a new indicator, which is with some people at Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is a vulnerability to misinformation indicator, which includes health misinformation, but political misinformation, the elections are stolen, the fraud information. And some of the answers to that are quite simple, very policy-oriented ones. I mean, in other words, better regulation of what's on social media, better local news, which has been gutted in this country because of the kind of the economic model that is now destroying journalism, good, reliable journalism. And we find that the same places that have high levels of despair, high levels of or low levels of advanced cognitive skills, there's something that Carolyn Mixter-Huxby calls advanced cognitive skill deserts. And her recent mapping of those across the country matches very closely with the maps we've done of deaths of despair and lack of hope. And so some of it's education, some of it's better being in better health, some of it is, combating some of the outcomes of despair, which include addiction and other things. I mean, there isn't sort of one magic bullet, but I think just recognizing that if we don't deal with despair as a problem in and of itself that has all kinds of really bad outcomes, we probably won't solve this crisis.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Any last questions? We'll probably close. Carol, if you have any last remarks for us, you'll be Francesco's going to close, but you'll be our last official speaker. You can give us something to go home with.
Well, I was hoping to give you some hope, but I've ended up talking about the US and deaths of despair a bit too much. So I don't want to really speak longer, except to say I think there is promise, the US aside, and maybe even now in the US. I think that thinking, because we've made traction on well-being, being able to take seriously concepts like hope, life satisfaction, eudaimonia, all those things are now entering for example, things like the ESGs and other things, even corporate behavior, I think things will change. And as I say, COVID was horrible, you know, it was a pandemic. But at the same time, I think it also made us realize how vulnerable as very wealthy societies we were to something that could really change our lives, and that had solving it had something to do with income, but not only. And it had to do with trust in government and trust in institutions and all sorts of things. And you could do a, you know, like a Venn diagram of what hope links to, and it's gonna, you know, it doesn't link to low levels of trust or to, you know, vulnerability to misinformation. It's going to link to the better things. So I think, and despair does link to the bad, the sort of the negative sides of it all. So I think it's an important part of what we try and do going forward in terms of, you know, building more resilient, healthier societies.
If you get tired of the United States, you decide not to go to Peru, you know where you can join us.
Luxembourg, I'll
Yes.
be there.
Oh, great. Thank you very much, Carol.
Thank you, Kelsey.